it offers cheaper milk, but it's the one that operates at the margins of legality. So of course, for the government, it's a problematic sector that they would rather see closing down. So what we wanted to do is, we wanted to design an intervention that could demonstrate that the informal markets can deliver good food, can deliver safe milk, and that can also be a path to improve nutrition in households. So we wanted to have evidence to convince the government that they are better off supporting the sector than shutting it down. So that's why we designed an intervention, and we wanted to demonstrate that it could have effects in two specific outcomes. One of them is on food safety, and this is about bacterial counts on the milk. We wanted to see a reduction of bacterial counts. And on nutrition, we engaged the clients in those vendor shops where we were working with, and we wanted to see if children will drink more milk, and that will have an effect on their diet adequacy for protein, calcium, and vitamin 12. So we designed an intervention that had these three components, and we were working with the vendors, not with the households. The first one was a training intervention. This was about 15 hours of training divided into small chunks, about 2 hours every 3 or 4 days. And they were taught how to handle milk safely, how to certain business skills, very basic, but also how to negotiate with their suppliers, how to demand better milk, and also how to promote milk and their milk among their customers. So it had also an emphasis on those soft skills. But another novel aspect about this training was that we made a lot of emphasis on using modern ways of teaching. So it was not a regular session, they sit down and you tell them what they need to know. It was all centered around their experiences, very practical. People will open to discuss the challenges they were facing. And also we used a lot of new methods from adult learning theory, role plays, discussions, case studies. So that was the basis of the training. Now, to support also the learning and perhaps help the sustainability of the intervention, we were also conducting some visits post-training to the vendors to report results of the milk samples that we were collecting, so how safe their milk was. So on those visits, the trainers will meet the vendors, tell them, the quality of your milk is this now, and it compares to your peers in this way, it compares to the standards in this other way. And it was used as a moment for reflecting about the challenges that the vendors were experiencing, implementing the learnings from the training. And finally, and this was the third component and the one that was steered towards improving nutrition in the client households, we developed a milk marketing campaign. So in that milk marketing campaign, we wanted to do as the big brands and big companies do. We wanted to find a way of promoting milk consumption of our consumers. So we developed a simple logo, and that's the round image you see on the top left that says Kila mtoto kila siku. In Kiswahili, that means every child, every day. You are supposed to give 2 cups of milk. The children at that moment were drinking, according to our surveys, a bit less than that. Half of that, yes, basically. And then we developed calendars, materials that the vendor will wear. So there were hats and aprons and measuring jars that had the logo. And then plenty of materials that the vendor could give away for free, stickers and calendars to their customers with all this information. So there was an emphasis on simple messaging and yes, on actually having messages that speak to the what all parents want, which is that the children strive in life and they become strong and intelligent and go to university. So that was the milk marketing campaign. Now these 3 components were tested through a randomized controlled trial. So we recruited, basically, we did a census of vendors, recruited those that we needed and that were happy to participate in the study. In each of the vendors, we recruited a few households that were buying milk regularly from those vendors. And then we randomly assigned the vendors to a treatment and a control group. The treatment group got that intervention. The control group got it after the end line. And we collected data mostly at baseline and end line, but a little bit also throughout. So what did we find? And remember, we wanted to have an effect on 2 types of outcomes. So in terms of food safety outcomes, did we change anything? Oh, right. These are not the last slides. So I don't have results, it seems. All right, I'll tell you the results verbally. So in terms of food safety, we realized that there was no difference, actually, between the treatment and control, about 9 months after the intervention started. So we were not able to lower the bacterial count. Now, there was a signal that maybe there was a small drop 3 months after the intervention, but by 9 it had disappeared. Now, impacting food safety and bacterial counts is complicated because it doesn't depend only on what happens at the vendor level. It's very much affected by how the milk has been kept and actually harvested from the farm. So that makes us think that perhaps we should have considered having interventions at earlier stages of the value chain. Also could be that the intervention is not powerful enough to sustain over time, and that after 9 months, they are not incentivized to put in practice the practices we wanted to see. But definitely, we think there's more we can think through to really have an impact on food safety. And what did we find in terms of nutrition? Well, interestingly, our outcome, which was dietary adequacy on those 3 nutrients, we didn't find a difference on that. So that ratio, that value or indicator hadn't really changed. But what we did find is change in what had to do with milk intake. So the groups, the children in the households that bought milk from the treatment vendors increased their milk consumption daily by about 40 to 50 milliliters of milk, which is pretty substantial considering the context where we are. And we also found that actually something we feared, if they drink more milk and the milk is not safe, maybe they have more diarrhea. Actually, there were no difference in prevalence of diarrhea among the treatment and control. So what are our conclusions from that? Well, that to impact food safety, you really need to do maybe more comprehensive interventions, especially when your indicator is bacterial count, and that we need to think on the sustainability of the intervention. But when it comes to nutrition, yeah, we maybe didn't have an impact on the outcome, but it's quite encouraging to see that marketing campaign really has the power to potentially dictate whether kids are given milk or not, or how much they are given. So I think this is an area that on which there is little evidence, and I hope we can continue building on. To conclude, I just want to say, like our plenary speaker said today, it's no time for pessimism. I want to look at this with informed positivism. And actually, the next speaker is going to tell you a little bit about the more positive notes and findings from this study, even in relation to food safety. So that's all from me.
Thank you, Sylvia. I now invite Emily Kilonzi to continue this discussion about More Milk Project and also talk about process evaluation. And while she's getting here, just to let you know that you please note your questions for each of the speakers. We will be taking them towards the end. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'll be talking on the process evaluation that we did to see the impact this intervention had on the participants that we were working with. Okay, so we did a process evaluation in 2 phases. One was done a few weeks after the start of the intervention, and the targets of this evaluation were the intervention vendors that had been trained and the trainers that we were using to train the vendors. We were hoping to understand how the planning of the training went, how prepared the trainers were to train the vendors in terms of the new teaching methods that they were using, in terms of the peer support system that we had in place. And we also wanted to understand from the vendors how easy or how easy it was for them to attend the training in terms of logistics, the content that was delivered to them, how well they understood, how appropriate it was to their situation, and what kind of environment the trainers provided for them to facilitate their learning process. We also sought to understand how satisfied they were with the training on how it was conducted and how likely they were to apply the lessons they learned from that training. Then at the end of the intervention, towards the end of last year, we did another process evaluation, trying to understand if these vendors had adopted the practices that they'd learned, and also to understand if any changes, if there were any changes they'd made, and if any changes at all had made any impact in their businesses. And we also spoke to households to see if this intervention had any impact on them too. Okay, so our findings were, in terms of knowledge, yes, the vendors gained knowledge from the content that was delivered to them in the training, in terms of milk hygiene practices, in terms of how they preserve milk in their shops to keep it safe, in terms of how they communicate with their vendors, with their customers and their suppliers, in terms of the business skills that were taught to them, and also in terms of how they can source good quality milk for their premises. In terms of practices, was there a change? Did this knowledge translate to any changes in practices? Yes, there were changes in the practices of vendors. They reported that they were now practicing better hygiene measures in their shops in terms of the equipment they were using to keep their milk, and also the space where they were selling the milk from. And they were also testing the milk once they received it from their suppliers to make sure it was not adulterated and it was still of good quality. They were engaging more with their customers to understand more about the milk that they're buying from them, whether it's keeping well in the households, if they're having any complaints about the milk, and how they're handling the milk once it gets to their households from the shops. And they're also engaging with their suppliers to teach them the lessons that they'd learned from the training on how they should handle milk at the farm, and the transport of the milk from the farm to the shop premises, and the right containers that they should use to store this milk. The vendors also reported that they had started keeping records in their shops of the milk products they were receiving, what time it came in and what time it was being sold, the records of their sales to see if their business was going on a positive note, making profits or loss. And they were also handling and preserving milk better, so it was keeping longer in the shops without going bad. The vendors also reported that they were speaking to the mothers that were buying milk from them, advising them on the nutritional value of feeding more milk to their children and how much milk they should feed and how they should handle that milk before they feed it to the children. And they were also making steps to improve the shop premises where they were selling milk, which was one of the lessons that they were taught during the training, to make their shops more presentable and clean so that the shop can advertise the product they are selling and speak to its quality. So did these practices that they started doing have any impact on the businesses? Yes, the practices translated to real change in their businesses. One of the change that they reported was that, sorry about that. So one of the changes that the vendors reported that they were doing is that they had increased the number of customers they had in their shops. That was through the process of the word of mouth. The customers they originally had were going around and advising their friends to come buy milk from these shops because it was better quality milk and they had no complaints about their vendors. And they also had more loyal customers. Their customers would stay longer, would stay in their shops and not move to buy milk in other shops. Another change that they reported was that the sales in their shops had increased. The more customers they had meant that they were selling more milk, and from that they were getting more profits. One of the vendors went as far as told us that even when he went ahead and increased the price of his product, his customers still stayed and even had more customers coming in because his product could speak for itself. Another change that they spoke of was a reduction in losses that they were receiving previously because they didn't have any milk going bad. They couldn't throw any milk at the end of the day. They were selling more milk and they didn't have any complaints where customers complained and sent back the milk that went back bad after they bought it. The other impact that came up was that there was increased shelf life of the milk. Sometimes when they buy milk, it only stays in the shelf for a few hours and it goes bad. That's because it's either been contaminated in the process by the time it comes to their shop or even at their shops. But now, because they were handling the milk better and they had better hygiene practices, it was staying much longer. So all these changes translated to growth in their businesses. And this growth was in terms of income that they were earning, and also in terms of reduced losses. And how this growth, they were able to show this growth was through expanding their businesses, like increasing the number of products they were selling, or even using the earnings from this business to start new businesses altogether. We also noted some impact on the households. They reported that the vendors they had been buying milk from had improved their premises. They were cleaner. They were displaying they were selling the right product and displaying showing them how they're testing milk, displaying that what they were selling is clean to the customers openly. And that translated to them having more trust in the vendors. And because of that, they were able to purchase more milk and feed more milk to their children. They also reported that the vendors had shown them how to handle milk in their homes, and they were feeding more milk to their children that was safer and boiled appropriately. They also mentioned that the marketing materials that they received through the vendors had clear messages that they were able to read and understand and apply in their homes. So what do we conclude from this? Yes, the more milk intervention had good lessons that the vendors and the households understood. And these lessons translated to practices, changes in practices and skills. And these practices had a positive effect on businesses. Even though Sylvia just reported that the results do not show much change, uh, one of the secondary outcomes to measure the change in practices, from what we've already the data has still been analyzed, but from what we've seen from the process evaluation we did with the vendors is that it has worked. These real changes in practices, and with a much bigger scale intervention, a well-planned intervention on a bigger scale, we can hope to see bigger changes in the informal dairy industry. Thank you.
Thank you both, Sylvia and Emily, for talking about the More Milk project and sharing your interesting findings. I now invite Lisa Butler, who will talk about the HIV infected children and how their intervention made a difference.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today on behalf of my research team, including colleagues in Kenya and in the United States. I'll present some of the results from our study of an agricultural and finance intervention called Shamba Maisha. Today, with a focus on the effect of the intervention on somatic growth of children living in HIV-affected households in Western Kenya. Over 10% of the world's population is undernourished. The number of people who are hungry globally has been increasing over the past few years due to a combination of factors, including extreme climate extremes, conflict, and macroeconomic challenges, which I think have affected pretty much all of us here. In Kenya, approximately 22% of the population have insufficient food consumption, largely due to low agricultural productivity that's caused by lack of rainfall. About 25% of the population in Kenya have insufficient food consumption, and this proportion has been rising steadily, even just over the past several months. In Kenya, 26% of the country's 7 million children are affected by chronic malnutrition, 11% are underweight, and 4% are affected by acute malnutrition. Children living in households that are affected with one or more adults living with HIV are at elevated risk of undernutrition. Chronic food insecurity and undernutrition can lead to increased risk of morbidity, cognitive and developmental deficits, and stunted growth, all of which, in combination with other environmental stressors, can adversely impact children's life trajectories, including cognitive development, mental and physical health, school performance, and productivity in their adult life. So it's against this background that we sought to address this research question. Does a multi-sectoral, climate-adaptive, agricultural, livelihood intervention improve growth outcomes for children under 5 years old who are living in households affected by HIV and food insecurity? We conducted the study in 3 counties in Nyanza region, which is in Western Kenya, in Homa Bay, Migori, and Kisumu, where there's a high prevalence of food insecurity and undernutrition, as well as a high burden of HIV, with prevalences ranging from 15 to 18% across these counties. The study was nested within a pair-matched cluster randomized control trial designed to test the effectiveness of an agricultural and finance intervention against Shamba Maisha on both adult and child outcomes. I'll come back to that slide, but first, this intervention included 3 components. It included a human-powered water pump, which was produced by Kickstart International, a loan of about $175 to acquire the pump, seeds, fertilizer, and any other commodities for farming, as well as training and sustainable agricultural practices and financial literacy. The clusters were health facilities in the 3 counties. A total of 16 health facilities were included. Pairs of health facilities were matched based on size of facility, geography defined by sub-county, primary source of water for irrigation, and access to markets. In each pair, one health facility was randomized to intervention and the other to control. For the parent study, we enrolled men and women living with HIV who are between 18 and 60 years old and receiving antiretroviral therapy, and who are food insecure or malnourished in the year preceding the study, and who had access to farmland. For the nested pediatric study, we enrolled children who were 6 to 36 months and their primary caregivers who resided in the compounds or households of the participants in the parent study. The children enrolled in the intervention arm of the adult study were assigned as the intervention arm in our pediatric study, and likewise the ones enrolled in the control were enrolled in the control arm. We hypothesized that the intervention would improve household wealth and food security, leading to improved child health, growth, and development outcomes by way of improved caregiver physical health, mental health, and behavioral outcomes. Now for the results. A total of 359 children and their primary caregivers were enrolled to the study, with 173 in the intervention arm and 186 in the control arm. The mean age at enrollment was about 21 months of age. 50% were female, and over 70% of those enrolled were from households that were severely food insecure. So here you see the most important of all of the results. So here you see the results of the difference and differences analysis on length and weight for age Z-scores for children enrolled at 6 to 24 months of age. On the left, you see the length for age Z-score for the control group in blue and the intervention group in red. We found that length increased more in the intervention arm than in the control arm across the 24 months of follow-up. Specifically, over the follow-up period, children in the intervention arm grew 1. No effect was observed in weight or height. And in conclusion, our findings provide evidence that a household-level agriculture. The findings highlight the importance of such interventions for children, especially during the earliest years of life. It's important to emphasize that this was done without doing anything to promote feeding, which raises the question as to whether we could further potentiate this intervention to further promote child health and growth outcomes. Future work must explore strategies for furthering the impact of such interventions to promote optimal health and development of children. And finally, our findings have important implications for consideration of the design of the HIV-sensitive social protection interventions. Thank you so much for your funders, without whom this would not have been possible. Thank you.
For keeping to time. May I now ask the online participant? We have an online presentation now from Sinovena Mauli.
Can you hear me?
You have 10 minutes. Please go ahead. We can see your slides.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to present at this platform. A very good evening from my end of the world. I'm currently based in Australia, but I'm from the Solomon Islands. I'm a PhD student at the University of Wollongong here in Sydney, Australia. And in that, I'll be presenting a case study, which is part of my PhD research, of which I've been looking at linking nutrition and fisheries management policy spaces for better livelihood and health outcomes in Solomon Island communities. Just to share with you all, this is a collaboration of those seen on the screen, to mention my supervisory team, the funder of my PhD research, and also my university, and a big thank you to the organizers of this conference. To give you a context, this is my country, Solomon Islands. We are a Pacific Island country based not far from Australia. We stretch along a archipelago of 9 main provinces that stretch across many islands. The aim being that a lot of our communities rely on fisheries, on the fisheries sector for their daily consumption and is a source of livelihood. And in that, we've got high montane forests to low-lying islands, and we've got a diverse range of cultures and customs. And with that being, communities being very dependent on the fisheries sector, took me to the aim of this study, which was looking at identifying some opportunities to strengthen policy in Solomon Islands, such as fish availability, price, and marketing, which can be improved for domestic consumers in the urban areas, which is the capital, Honiara. Next slide. Though we are a very small island state, similar to many of our neighbors in the Pacific, we are faced by the external shocks of climate change. And in that, we have low-lying islands of which live very close to the coastline and depend very highly on coastal resources. And in that, they encounter the emerging threats of climate change. We're also faced by the influx of development activities, as communities call it, which is obviously logging. And in that, this has been one of the threats to our environment, not only the terrestrial environment, but to that of the fisheries sector in the last 40 years. Next slide. Seeing the threats of these external shocks to the environment, I took on this study particularly with the attention that malnutrition has a substantial social and economic impact in most small island developing states. And in that, particularly for the Solomon Islands, malnutrition is the third leading risk factor for death and disability, which came about from a combined report in 2017. And in that, 16%, which is less than 5 years, children who are less than 5 years, hence 32% have experienced the stunted growth and 10% being severely stunted. So in that, with that being alarming, despite the strong policies for managing fisheries and coastal marine resources, the prevalence has been on strengthening some of the local access, of which people living in the urban areas can access some of the abundant fish which is in the rural areas of the urban areas. Next slide, thank you. With not only that, we are similar to our neighbors in the Pacific, as I earlier mentioned, in that these issues are also prevalent in the Pacific region. However, particularly for Solomon Islands, of which I took this study looking at the high prevalence of malnutrition, which is indicated, there needs to be that strengthening of local access. And in that, looking at policy attention, which was my focus, was to make sure there is that opportunity for domestic supply of fish and policy of which governs the domestic supply of fish across the sectors. And in that, some key relevant agencies as named on the slide are involved in this process. Next slide. The methodology I took in the study was I did a policy analysis as one of my phases. In that, I looked particularly at the documentary analysis, looking at the existing policies relevant to the fish supply chain in Solomon Islands, and in that, identify some of the strengths which I see as the potential opportunities for policy change to improve access for affordable fish. And in that, I did a number of qualitative interviews with key informants within the government sector, the development partner sector, the non-government organizations who work in this space, and research-related institutions, in hoping that the feedback from these interviews will also provide some of the policy challenges, and in that look into successes and the opportunities for further action in relation to fish supply chain. All these interviews were coded using a qualitative software in Vivo 12 to check on the commonly cited issues affecting that of the fish supply chain, including management, harvest, the transport of fish from rural areas to the urban areas, the storage, the consumption, and more so the export of fish, even beyond Solomon Islands. Next slide. Some of my key findings in the results is having analyzed the fish supply chain policy, I identified there's a number of strengths. To mention, Solomon Island communities have practiced community-based fishery management for decades. And with consistent focus to that approach, there is that opportunity to enhance the fish supply chain. More so, there is explicit policy recognition of the links between fisheries and nutrition. As I mentioned earlier, having a small island state of which malnutrition has quite an alarming rate. So we're having that explicit link. There is that opportunity to link fish policy with that of nutrition policy. And in that, there are policy successes of which community-based fishery management efforts in these local villages are mostly talked of by the interviews of which you could see. I've presented some of the quotes on the furthest right of the slide. And in that too, there is an increased need for capacity in the provincial governments. And despite limiting government capacity, communities themselves have taken action in implementing these community-based fisheries management approach.
Nuviva, you just have 1 minute more. Please summarize.
I'm almost to summarize. Thank you. Thank you for letting me know. So in that, these are also some of the results, seeing that there are challenges in gaps of policy implementation. There's need for effective monitoring. There's failure of implementation due to local benefit and some of the challenges in the supply chain. And the urban supply chain is constrained by infrastructure-related challenges. Conclusion. So in summary, there are key strengths in policy space, as there is the management approaches and explicit recognitions. I appreciate the challenges of gaps in implementations, in capacity, and limited attention, but hoping with expanding community-based fisheries management approach, as well as policy coordination and implementation, are some of the key opportunities to improve sustainable outcomes for livelihood, environment, and nutrition. Final slide. With that, thank you so much for listening, and thank you again for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for keeping to time. Okay, may I now invite Lan Nawin, to talk about impact pathways from seed to nutrition.
Hello, everyone. So thank you for being here. I'm from Wageningen University, and today this afternoon, very beautiful. I'm going to tell you the story of my research. We found a very funny results, and I'm here to ask for your opinion, feedback, advice, whatever. Just come to me and tell after you hear my story. My research is about measuring the impact of a nutrition-sensitive agricultural intervention, or NSA, in the ethnic minority group in northern Vietnam. And why we're doing that? Because this group suffer heavily from under nutrition. And then we think that because people eating lack of diversity could be the reason for that. And then that situation being worse during the COVID, because many research show that during COVID, farmers have limited food access, and their input supply being disrupted, and their income being unstable. And before COVID, and here everyone, many people working on a nutrition-sensitive agriculture, and we found a very bright picture of the impact in improving farmers' diversity, especially in developing settings. But could this intervention work in my context or not? And if yes, then how it's gonna work, and by which mechanism? And here in our research, we focus only on 3 nutrient-sensitive food groups, including dark green leafy vegetables, legumes, and other vitamin A-rich vegetables. And for our NSA, it's very basic. Like we provide a random 18 clusters, nutrition and agriculture training. And within that training, we provide them like theoretical sessions, participatory cooking, and audio podcast, some sort of discussions, posters, and handouts. And the training led by local trainers, and they receive assistance from field assistance from the Alliance of Biodiversity and CR. And then within the training participants, we provide random half of them diverse types of vegetable seeds and legumes that we call the seed provision intervention. And for our data, we collected two types of data, quantitative and qualitative. For quantitative component, we collected one baseline and two end-line routes. The reason why we have two end-lines is because of the power issue, and we want to improve power by adding an additional end-line for that. And then our sample is 600 households. And for qualitative component, we gather people to organize focus group discussions, interviews with village trainers, gathering field reports and field notes. And this is the COVID situation and how government responds for that, for you to get the overview how COVID hit our intervention. So it was taken place primarily in 2021. And then during this period, the government kind of like very confident that COVID is under our control. And then because they apply a very distinctive measure that called track and trace method, that they only target the high risk group. And then they apply the micro lockdown at neighborhood level instead of applying a large scale at society level. So the reason for that, so the government thinks it's a very wise method to allow the rest of the economy can operate as usual. So we take advantage of that to keep in-person meetings ongoing and provide the online assistance from the field instead of like hands-on and in-person assistance as we plan. And the training schedules can be very flexible whenever it's possible by the government and when people feel comfortable to come into in-person meetings. And the first line also taken place in the same year, but we are forced to stop because at the beginning of 2022, the track and trace method failed. And then COVID come out of control. And then the government has to pause all the activity. And so that's why we cannot do anything within this period. And April onward, the government think, okay, we have the herd immunity now, and let's open up the economy. So we continue with our research, but like at this moment, we mainly focusing on collecting data. So this is the results. The majority of our group is women, and just to remind you, like we don't really specifically target women. We just invite those who are responsible for food preparation and know about vegetable production in the family. And it happens that like the majority of them are women, which is not very surprising. And they have limited literacy and very culturally diverse because there are 3 ethnic groups joining our sample. The production diversification is very common in this region, and at least like almost every household grow at least one type of vegetable and legume. And we observe a very high consumption rate of dark green leafy vegetable, but not the other 2 food groups, which are legume and other vitamin A rich vegetable. And they have a pretty good road conditions and also like market access. And those characteristics are balanced at baseline. And here the results I want to show you. Like we found like this is a selected set of our outcome variables. In terms of diversity, we found negative impact effect of the training at the key food group level. And then when we look at the species level, we found that there's a negative impact on the food come from the market, like come from market pathway. And also like the training group grow less crop diversity. And those results of diversity disappear after multiple hypothesis testing. But the crop diversity, the negative impact on crop diversity stands after the correction. And but we found a positive impact of seed provision being added on top of the training, that it is like stand hold and significance even after the multiplicity correction. Yeah. And for qualitative results, we found that like actually people kind of like the training, but they also like show up a very good constructive criticism over that they think that the material is a little bit difficult for them and the training duration is a little bit too short. And but the seed provision, they like it a lot because farmers like experiment with new crops and try new tests. So we kind of investigate a little bit more about how COVID can overrule our trials. And then we asked them some sort of questions on how they perceive the impact of COVID on them. And we found that there's some imbalance between training and control groups. But however, when we look at the number of actual cases and their close contacts, we don't find any significant difference between treated and control groups. So this is a kind of our pseudo discussion, sort of. We think that like based on the results so far that we can interpret, we think that like the COVID-19 or any shocks relating to social distancing limit the potential of NSA because like people really diversity is no longer their optimal thing, and they care more about livelihood security. But more importantly, the interactions between the project team and beneficiary being limited, and also like limit our chance to really learn about like the context and the needs of the people. And so it limit our chance to really adjust the intervention accordingly. But this kind of thing only explain that we don't have impact, but not negative impact. So we think like could targeted social distancing can play a role here. And then within this, we believe that adding seed provision is a very nice idea to maintain the potential of the NSA. And the impact pathway for this is mainly via on-farm production. Thank you so much for your listening.
May I now ask the last speaker, Memory Nawanga? She's from Luanar.
Good afternoon. I'm Memory Nawanga. The background, 2018, about 21.9% of the world's children under the age of 5 years were stunted. And in Malawi, more than 30% of children are stunted. And attitude is associated with the risk of stunted growth in children. And spatial analysis allows allocation of resources to most affected areas and the designing of cost-effective interventions. However, information on spatial distribution of child stunting, according to Orchard in Malawi, is scarce. The study design, this was a cross-sectional secondary data analysis study, and it used data from the 2018 community-based nutrition study, and it was a mixed methods design that used both quantitative as well as qualitative data collection measurements. And the sample size was calculated for each of the Malawi's districts separately, and the actual number that was included in the analysis was 4,220. And on analysis, there was descriptive statistics, independent t-test, Pearson chi-square, variable logistic regression, and emergency nutrition assessment for SMART to generate these scores based on WHO growth standards, shape files for Malawi from National Statistical Office, and the Quantum Geographical Information System software. And on results, this figure shows that about 34.6% of children were stunted in low orchard area, and 40.6% of children were stunted in high orchard areas. And according to Ed, you see that when you focus on the high altitude areas, you see that most children remain stunted up to the age of 36 to 47%. And on the spatial distribution, this is the map of northern region, and the dark shaded areas shows the high percentage of stunting. And when you at the far top, you see TAs like TM in Nigeria, where there was high prevalence of child stunting. And also when you look at Zimba, TH Indi, you also see that there were more children who were stunted. And this is the map of Central Region. The same picture when you look at Nchinji and Kasungu. This is the map of Southern Region. And or looking at the relationship between child stunting and adulthood, you see that children living in high adulthood areas were at a more risk of being stunted by 35%. In conclusion, the study found that there was high prevalence of child stunting in high altitude areas than in low altitude areas. However, the spatial distribution maps showed variations in child stunting within a district, and altitude influences child stunting, holding other factors constant. And on recommendations, intervention should be location specific, focusing on areas with high prevalence, such as high altitude areas. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. First of all, thank you everyone for keeping to time, and it was really fantastic to get in the 50 minutes that we got an amazing view of right from milk to fish to biodiversity to stunting in children. Was really good and great. In terms of coming to questions, I want to summarize a few things before we take up questions and open the floor. We often hear food systems being thought of as a spaghetti bowl. But I would like today the audience and all of us to think of it more like Lego pieces. It's not that I have my son, that's why I'm talking about games and things, but I would like every piece. If you see Lego, it's just an analogy which I'm trying to share with you. There are so many pieces which can be fitted and you can make different things with it. Food systems has to be like that. It's not necessary that there is one solution for any problem, and there are multiple problems, as you know, in the food systems. So I think what we emphasize from the variety of presentations and in general is that food systems need to be having that element of resilience, that flexibility, that adaptability. And because I like to, probably think in acronyms, for me, food systems and the message which I got from the table stands to reinforce that the food system should be strong, STRONG, 6 alphabets for 6 presentations. Because the first S to me means stakeholders to be steered to a sustainable, secure, nurtured, and nourished future. That's the S, that's the crux I got from all of this. That all the stakeholders, including the vulnerable population of children, pregnant mothers, adolescents, whichever group that you may name, they all need to have a sustainable, secure future. And in this sustainable word, I'm encompassing the elements of climate change, the food security issues that we are facing largely these days. The T stands for, in the strong, T stands for training, which a couple of our colleagues here talked about. You see how capacity building is so important. And it's very important in food systems to bring this diversity, this multidisciplinarity in training as well. It's not just training in nutrition or training in foods per se, but bringing economists, agriculturists, public health, so many other fields into this room. And so create leaders at all levels. This training should lead to having leaders at all levels. And these leaders should also remember the context. The local capacity building is very important. So ST, okay? The R stands for resilience, the one which I started with. I think adaptability, flexibility, I cannot emphasize less the importance of these important elements. And also because it gives preparedness as a very important feature. We saw COVID, and Memory alluded to that a little bit right now, how, Van, so many of the elements just were thrown out, the pieces which we thought were going on fine when COVID struck. So I think our food systems need to have that element of resilience, that preparedness in them. The O stands for One Health. I think we heard from multiple forums today that biodiversity, whether it's fish, milk, whichever green leafy vegetables, anything, all these elements in nutrition also need to be linked with one health. Ultimately, it's everybody who needs to be nurtured and nourished on this planet. And there is no planet B, as we all know, right? So I think to get to optimal nutrition, the other O, it's important to emphasize one health from this platform of ANH. Also, this O stands and reflects opportunity to accountability, to be accountable. Ultimately, as stakeholders, somewhere, everybody has to be responsible in some ways. All of us who've committed your times and resources to come and be at this conference, this accountability really matters to all of us. So I think that also is reflected by this O. The N for me stands for the new element, the innovative aspects. And as Imana sort of emphasizes many times, the tools, metrics, technology to get better data, to get better answers or solutions. I think this newness, this innovativeness in the food systems is also a critical piece. And we saw some of our colleagues here show that nuanced approach to approaching the same old problems. So I think that is, again, a very important element as N. And last but not the least, in terms of time, is G. And for G, because I couldn't get the direct word, I said get life cycle and get multiple forms of malnutrition into the piece. Everyone has to eat, guys, right? Everyone. It's not only children, it's not only pregnant mothers, it's not only elderly. So let's think of a life cycle approach in our food systems. I think for me, all these presentations and overall, this is my main message, being the privilege of chairing this, that our food systems need to be strong. Thank you. So with that, I close the session then. Thank you. Can I invite all of you to stand and get a group photograph? And then thank you very much for your patience, everyone.